I'd like to now preview the mid-year financial update that the board plans to publish very soon. The report will be the second edition in a new series of updates on Puerto Rico's financial performance. The Oversight Board plans to release each quarter. The goal of these updates is to provide an analysis of Puerto Rico's fiscal situation and potential risks to the financial plan. Perhaps more importantly, these reports are starting to provide the people of Puerto Rico, the government, and investors with more timely financial information and where Puerto Rico truly stands. This should improve the frequency and predictability of financial reporting. And while the board is preparing the initial reports, we intend to transition the effort to the government. I will review the two key components of the report. First, the year-to-date operating results. Second, the potential risks to the financial forecast. Let us first look at the revenues. If you look at actual fiscal year 2024 revenues relative to the fiscal plan forecast, the bars in blue, as well as the FY24 actuals versus last year's revenues, the bars in red, you will see both scenarios show actual general fund revenues exceed estimates and last year's performance. Year-to-date cumulative general fund revenue surpassed the forecast by $540 million and last year's revenues by about $400 million. This is mostly driven by strong performance in income taxes, both by individuals and corporations, sales tax, use taxes, and vehicle revenues. As mentioned previously, much of this was driven by the solid rebound of tax revenue nationwide following the massive stimulus from the U.S. government related to the COVID-19 pandemic. In Puerto Rico, strong collections from the export sector, companies, and high dynamism of some sectors in the economy boosted SUT revenues, also contributed. The graph also shows, however, that October accounted for approximately 50% of the year-to-date outperformance. So you see the bump in the middle of the chart. And what this might represent is really a lagging impact from tax year 2022, because final payments for those that filed extensions were due in October of 2023. And as you look to December, you see a significant deceleration. In fact, December is the first month this year where actual revenue collections were below projections and also below last year collections for the month of December. This is a sign that revenues may have started to plateau. Next, looking at expenses, general fund expenditures year-to-date were $111 million below the same period last year and $900 million below forecast. The lower than expected projected expenditures were primarily due to delays in recording $335 million of expenditures, mostly related to the Department of Education, with an additional $350 million of differences in timing as to when expenditures were being incurred compared to the forecast. Reporting delays stem from information system challenges and accounting deficiencies, highlighting the need for continued improvements on internal controls and financial management practices. Next slide is, although the cash balances increased in large part from higher collections, the vast majority of cash remains allocated for specific purposes, and certain spending is not yet reflected in the TSA balances. This includes funding set aside for prior year appropriations, such as capital investments, which we already set aside for use, but have not yet been spent. Specific appropriations, such as statutory restrictions and the plan of adjustment reserves, these are obligations that we know the government will eventually owe and spend, but we must set aside those resources now as the legal processes progress. Other restricted purposes, such as tax refunds and emergency reserves, are included in the cash balance. After setting aside the minimum cash needs, unrestricted cash remains limited when considering the economic uncertainties and financial risks discussed in the next slide. There are various potential risks to the certified fiscal plan that are being closely monitored and could impact the budget. The mid-year report continues to capture risks previously included in the Q1 report, such as uncertain long-term Medicaid federal funding, including a potential fiscal cliff beginning in FY 2028, an FMAP that may decrease from effectively 76% to 55%, the statutory minimum. Additional Commonwealth contributions to fund disaster relief projects due to inflation-based cost escalation and match requirements, and identified changes in spending and/or revenue that represent a risk to the financial plan. The midyear report also incorporates additional risks that have emerged. This includes risks such as the implementation of the OECD Pillar 2 global minimum tax, conforming tax legislation. Since income earned in Puerto Rico by multinational companies could be subject to top-up taxes under the Pillar 2 rules of other countries, it is important that the government judiciously monitor the ongoing shifts in the global tax landscape and consider ways to avoid this negative outcome. Additionally, recent legislation impacting spending or revenues. In the second quarter, the legislature continued its trend for passing or enacted 8 pieces of legislation amounting to a total estimated annual cost of between $10 and $26 million. And again, this is on top of legislation that they passed in the first quarter, enacting a very sizable tax cut. Examples of legislation passed this year or this quarter include passage of Act 16, which modifies the distribution of revenues from casino slot machines, Act 58, which amends Act 22 to eliminate the transfer of $3 from parking violations to the Commonwealth's general fund, and the passage of Act 88, which reforms the military code of Puerto Rico, affecting the salaries of some officers and the number of leave days allowed. Looking more closely, there continues to be funding pressures that present risks to the financial plan. These risks include operating needs, funding for outstanding liabilities, and initiatives proposed by the government. Totaling everything, the resources available by the Commonwealth are not sufficient to support all potential funding risks. So the government will need to prioritize any additional spending to ensure that the Commonwealth can afford it over not just this year, but over the long term. Over the coming months, the board is going to place increasing emphasis on getting the government to continue to put in place foundational long-term fiscal responsibility and controls in place.